Thank you, Excellency. Now I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Rémy Ngoy Lumbu, Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights of the African Union. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you. President of the Human Rights Council, High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished participants, all other protocol observed. Allow me at the outset to congratulate you on how you have been leading our debates today, and allow me to congratulate you on your election and to assure you that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights will stand by you and support you throughout your mandate in the framework of cooperation that we hope is mutually beneficial. My name is Rémy Ngoy Lumbu. I'm the President of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders in Africa, and a focal point on reprisals and focal point on judicial independence in Africa. Yesterday, the preparatory work for the International Charter on Human Rights, through its three major pillars first, and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and then through all subsequent extensions to those and additional conventions, brought promise of great hope for humanity. The question now is, does that hope still hold true with that work? Today, the efforts to implement the very same charter, in the name of which this 58th session of the Human Rights Council has been opened, do not bear the same promise as in the past. What can be done? In the meantime, an African Charter on Human and People's Rights was born in 1981. It entered into force in 1986. Its ambition was to pinpoint hallmarks of Africa which ought now to be taken into account. The particularity of this charter is that the individual focused approach to human rights is possible in Africa only in a community context or a more comprehensive global context, without it being necessary to point the finger in the event of violation, and in order to foster dialogue. That is what we call in Africa Ubuntu Sophia, or Ubuntu philosophy of human rights. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights is the oldest body of the African Union, and it is the first regional institution to have been tasked with the protection and promotion of human rights and the rights of peoples in Africa. It is the body of the African Union that is the closest to our citizens because it is accessible to everyone through its quasi-judicial framework that is flexible and people-centered. The vision of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in accordance with our Charter, the African Charter, is to foster human rights and to interpret the provisions of the Charter. In accordance with our mandate for promotion of human rights, the ACHPR has carried out more than 90 promotion exercises, and we have devised 7 additional draft protocols to the African Charter, 6 of which have already been adopted by the African Union, and we have also developed over 35 non-legally binding instruments in order to clarify the provisions of the African Charter so as to facilitate its implementation. Regarding the mandate for protecting human rights, to date, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has been seized with more than 862 communications, 4 of which are interstate ones. We have also been working on, we also submit periodic reports that are submitted to us by the states regarding the implementation of our Charter and its protocols, following which we provide concluding observations which take note of progress and areas of concern, and we make recommendations. The exercise to which African states submit themselves in this way is very, very similar to the treaty body reporting system. But unfortunately, we do have problems with delays. Many states are behind in submitting their reports in Africa to the African Commission, even though they are usually here before the Human Rights Council for the Universal Periodic Review. So our recommendation would be that such regular presence within the UPR ought to be reflected at the level of the reviews before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Our Commission has created special mechanisms that are akin to the special procedures in order to fully deliver on its mandate, but we work very closely with many UN special procedures. Regarding how my body cooperates with other institutions that are tasked with achieving the same mandate, I can tell you that it is with pleasure that our Commission very recently hosted the joint framework for the African Union and the United Nations on human rights, which was signed by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the President of the Commission of the African Union, His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat. That said, we have also built bridges for cooperation with all national human rights institutions in Africa and with civil society organizations. In fact, we are the institution that collaborates the most with civil society organizations and which gives them pride of place during our sessions. To date, the Commission has granted the status of affiliate to 37 national human rights institutions, including 2 specialized institutions, and we have granted observer status to 579 NGOs. And yet we do face several challenges within the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And one challenge relates to funding. And here I would like to appeal to you all, because unless things change, there will be no more Human Rights Commission in Africa, because the amount of funding available is ever dwindling. Allow me, before concluding, to highlight a few steps forward that have been achieved in Africa, and then I will also pinpoint a number of areas of concern. Regarding the positive aspects, the Agenda 2063 defined the great aspirations we have for the Africa we want, with an implementation monitoring plan as well. We've created the Continental Free Trade Area and recently protocols to the African Charter on the protection of the rights of older persons and a protocol on the rights of persons with disabilities have entered into force. We have also adopted regional human rights protection instruments, the most recent of which was the adoption during the 38th session of the African Union General Assembly of a new convention of the African Union on the elimination of violence against women and girls. This is in the context of our African positive masculinity. I'd also like to inform you that there is a trend of moving towards abolishing the death penalty in Africa, and their states are complying with the moratorium on executions for the most part. I would also like to talk about the charity-based regime that governs human rights in Africa. Africa always has to have its hand outstretched in order to get attention, be that here or in other fora or before the 54 states of our African continent. And the fact that Africa has to abide by this charity-based regime is something that you all ought to pay attention to. I'd also like to say that the sound of marching boots and weapons continues to deteriorate our security situation with multiple repercussions on human rights. In particular, we have persistent armed conflicts, for instance, in the east of the DRC, conflicts which have been condemned by Resolution 2773 of the United Nations Security Council. And the African Commission would like to draw member states' attention to this resolution so that it might be implemented and serve to alleviate the suffering of citizens in that region. I'd like to draw your attention to Sudan, where an unprecedented humanitarian disaster is underway. My institution is currently carrying out a fact-finding mission. I must also mention what is happening in Somalia, what is happening in Ethiopia in the Amhara region. Allow me also to draw your attention to the persistence of terrorism in North Cameroon, which is having a major impact on citizens. This also warrants your attention and your support. All these countries are suffering either from war or from terrorism. Allow me also to mention the Sahel region and instability in the Mozambique Channel. Allow me also to share with you another cause for concern for Africa, and that is political instability that stems from anti-constitutional coups, which are prohibited, categorically so, by the African Charter on Elections, Democracy and Good Governance. I'll mention the three countries that you'll be familiar with already: Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso. Even though these countries have been suspended from the African Union as regards their right to participate in certain bodies, well, our Commission, the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights, continues to interact with these three countries because you cannot suspend human rights. In fact, Burkina Faso even submitted a periodic report during one of our sessions, and we made recommendations for the benefit of the citizens of Burkina Faso. Before concluding, I'd also like to speak to you of another source of concern in the domain of economic, social and cultural rights, and that is youth unemployment. Young people aged under 25 represent 60% of our population, and there are no jobs for young people in Africa. So this is an appeal that I'm making to African states to tackle that problem. Also, basic infrastructure is in short supply or inadequate. Schools, hospitals, there are not enough of them in Africa. I'd also like to mention exploitation and the inequitable distribution of resources, corruption and its impact on the development of many of our countries. By way of conclusion, President, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights remains committed to cooperating with all stakeholders in order to strengthen protection and promotion of human rights in Africa. We call for concerted action, inclusive action and sustained action in order to advance the rights of African people. Thank you.